What a flood of folly and madness is broken in upon us.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. If you're just a little bit familiar with church history, the name John Wesley should be somewhat familiar to you. He is most notably the co-founder, along with his brother Charles, of the Methodist movement, which then turned into the Methodist Church. With just a little searching, you can find all sorts of sermons and quotes from Wesley dealing with all of the usual theological stuff. But did you know he had quite a bit to say about war? But if you're not too familiar with Wesley, I would like to go over a brief biography to introduce him. I think a person's words may have a different impact when we know a little of who said them, especially when and where they said these words. So let's dive into a little history first and get a better idea of who John Wesley was. John Wesley was born in June of 1703 in Epworth, England. He was the 15th child born to his parents, Samuel and Susanna Wesley. There were 19 total, but only 9 children lived past infancy. His father, Samuel, was an Anglican priest and poet. His mother, Susanna, homeschooled all their children, teaching them to be proficient in English, Latin, and Greek, and to memorize major portions of the New Testament. Pretty much all of the biographies of Wesley mention the Rectory fire of 1709 because it had a profound impact on him. So, a rectory is a residential home of the priest that is paid for by the church. And in 1709, the Wesleys' rectory caught fire late in the night. The Wesleys got all of their children out except for 5-year-old John Wesley. He was stuck on the top floor between a burning stairs and a collapsing roof. But 2 men, one standing on the other's shoulders, were able to lift Wesley out of the second-story window. Wesley would later quote Zechariah 3:2 when describing the event, saying that he was a brand plucked from the burning. In 1720, Wesley attended Christ Church University in Oxford. In 1724, Wesley graduated but stayed on for his master's degree. He was ordained a deacon the next year, in 1725. By March 1726, Wesley was unanimously elected the Fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. After reading William Law's Christian Perfection and A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, Wesley expressed his first explicit resolve to be all devoted to God. Soon after, John would join and lead his brother Charlie's small group called the Holy Club. The Holy Club was a society formed for the purpose of the study and the pursuit of a devout Christian life, and also had George Whitefield as an early co-founder. Whitefield would also become a very prominent evangelist. The Holy Club was looked at as fanatics because they met every day from 6 to 9 to read the Greek scriptures and pray for several minutes every hour. They began taking communion every Sunday rather than the common practice of 3 times a year, and fasted every Wednesday and Friday until 3 o'clock. They also began a prison ministry and ministered to the sick. Wesley's pietism was greatly increased when he traveled to the American colony of Georgia in 1735. During the voyage, a great storm snapped the mast of the ship. While the English voyagers panicked, the Moravian settlers stayed calm while they sang hymns and prayed. After a relatively unsuccessful and controversial attempt to evangelize the American natives and the English colonists of Georgia, Wesley returned to England feeling beaten and still looking to the Moravians for their strong missionary and pietistic traditions for counsel. But it wasn't until he heard a reading of Martin Luther's writing on salvation through Christ alone that his methods in ministry began a dramatic shift. He would write of this experience in his journal. In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. After this, we see a revitalized Wesley spend many years associating with groups and preachers as he started to craft his brand of doctrine and practices. It's in the 1770s that we see Wesley speaking up about war. And can you guess which war in the 1770s that he might have been referring to? If you guessed the American Revolution, you are correct. So I admittedly tread carefully on this subject because it elicits some very emotional responses. But what I personally think is a good practice is surveying a large swath of Christian opinions on any given subject. And with the American Revolution, we generally just leave it to the voices from the colonies. So Wesley, I think, is someone worth hearing and comparing what he has to say about the war at this time and hear these other voices from the other side of the pond during the Revolution. And like I said, compare it to what we already know and have heard from voices in the colonies. To see some of the issues that Wesley took with the American Revolution, I'll have a link to an article by David Swartz called 4 Reasons Why John Wesley Opposed the American Revolution. In this article, Swartz points out that Wesley felt the colonists enjoyed many liberties under British rule and rebuked the colonists' claim that taxation was tyranny. Swartz's second point is showing, as ministers preached sermons that stoked the fires of war, Wesley cautioned about the consequences of out-of-control protest, and then quotes from a 1775 sermon titled National Sins and Miseries, in which Wesley worried that reason is lost in rage, its small, still voice drowned by popular clamor. It seems that Wesley was also concerned about the freedom of speech. In Swartz's third point, he includes several quotes that expressed concern that the colonists wouldn't let anyone utter or print anything in opposition to the revolution. The fourth point was Wesley suggesting the irony of proclaiming freedom while the Americans owned slaves. In 1774, while the rhetoric was heating up, Wesley wrote, "Are they men as well as we? And have they not the same sensibility?" Again, I will have a link to this article in the show notes. It's worth looking at how much Wesley addressed these concerns of revolution during that time. But I am actually more interested in some of Wesley's more astute observations about war in general. There is a great reenactment of many of Wesley's statements and sermons by Mark Topping, online and on DVD. And fortunately, the war part, which lasts about 5 minutes, can be found on YouTube. I will have a link to it, but I'd also like to play it here and maybe go over some of the points that he makes in it. So here you go. This is John Wesley's Thoughts on War.
I would speak to you of a most horrid reproach to the name of Christian. Yea, a reproach to all men and women, to all reason and humanity. There is war in the world, and war undertaken by Christians. I mean, by those that bear the name of Christ and profess to walk as he also walked. Now, who can reconcile war? I will not ask who can reconcile it to religion or Christianity, but who can reconcile it to any degree of reason or common sense? But you ask, is there not a cause? Oh yes, there are numerous causes of war. Among the chief are these: the ambition of princes, or the corruption of their ministers, difference of opinion. Sometimes two princes make a war to decide which of them shall dispossess a third of his dominions. Sometimes a war is commenced because another prince is too strong. Sometimes because he is too weak. Sometimes our neighbours want the things we have, or have the things we want. And so both fight until they take ours or we take theirs. And there is another cause which drags on poor victims into the field of blood. It is a great phantom which stalks before them, and which they are taught to call liberty. It is this which breathes into their hearts a stern love of war and thirst for vengeance and contempt of death. Real liberty, meantime, is trampled underfoot and lost in anarchy and confusion. But whatever the cause, let us calmly and impartially consider the thing itself. See, here are 40,000 men gathered together on this ground. What are they going to do? Well, here are 30 or 40,000 more at a little distance. Well, these are going to shoot them through the head or the body, to stab them and split their skulls and send most of their souls to everlasting fire as fast as they possibly can. Why so? What harm have they done to them? Oh, none at all. They do not so much as know them. But this king had a quarrel with this king, and so these are going to kill as many of those as they can in order to prove their king in the right. What an argument is this! And what a method of proof! What an amazing way of deciding controversies! But so it is, and oh, what horrors attend upon it! The blood and wounds of thousands and thousands. The burning cities, ravaging and laying waste the country. For once the sword is drawn, where may it stop? Who can command it be put up in its scabbard, and it will obey? Once the sword is drawn, upon whom may it light? What then, you ask, must we do? Do? My brothers and sisters? Why, what would we do if either our own or our neighbour's house were on fire? We would bring, if in our senses, no combustible matter to increase the flame, but water and a helping hand in order to extinguish it. Now apply this to the present situation. It is like a house on fire, and the devouring flame is already kindled, and many thousands of lives have fallen prey to its insatiable violence. Who that seriously considers this awful contest can help lament such an astonishing want of wisdom, which means we are apparently unable to resolve the matter without bloodshed? Oh, how is wisdom perished from the wise! What a flood of folly and madness is broken in upon us!
If you're interested in purchasing the video in its entirety, you can go to revjohnwesley.com. I really like the performance Topping gives, and I think they gathered some really great quotes from Wesley. I liked how he questions if war can be reconciled to reason and common sense. The more I look at these giant conflicts, even those of the 20th century, with their massive death tolls, just millions of people thrown to the meat grinder, as Dan Carlin calls it, I try to look at the reason and common sense, as Wesley points out. Just looking at quick numbers online, World War I had about 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. Among the deaths, it's estimated that 9.7 million were military of the various forces involved, and 10 million civilians. And even though World War I was considered the war to end all wars, World War II showed an estimated 75 million lives lost. About 20 million soldiers from all sides, and about 40 million civilians lost their lives directly from the war, while millions more died of starvation and disease related to the war. And just to narrow down on the common sense aspect of Wesley's remarks, I want to highlight one particular event in World War I that I will always think back to. It is memorialized in the song The Price of a Mile by the historical metal band Sabaton. In this song, Sabaton describes the Battle of Passchendaele, which was the third battle of Ypres in Belgium. For about 3.5 months, the European Allied forces battled the German army over a gain of just 6 miles. During that time, after intense shelling and rainfall, the mud became so soft and deep that it swallowed an estimated 42,000 men, then providing a stable yet rancid ground for other soldiers as they fought from pit to pit. As they moved in this mud that could be up to their armpits, they could hear the gurgling screams from other soldiers all around them, and they knew as they were stepping on bodies of men that had been previously walking or wounded in that very spot. The song asks, "What's the price of a mile?" and answers back that the price was paid in young men's lives. In total, about 450,000 men were killed during the Battle of Passchendaele, making the price of a mile in Belgium 1917. Each of the 6 miles, the price was 75,000 lives.
It's a stalemate at the front line, where the soldiers rest in mud. Roads and houses, all is gone. There's no glory to be won. Know that many men will suffer. Know that many men will die. 500,000 lives at stake as the fields of Passchendaele. And as the night falls, the general calls, and the battle carries on and on. What is the purpose of it all? What's the price of a mile? Thousands of feet march to the beat. It's an army on the march. Long way from home, paying the price in young men's lives. Thousands of feet march to the beat. It's an army in despair. Knee deep in mud, stuck in a trench with no way out.
And Wesley, applying this question of common sense to war, and are looking into direct conflicts within that context, in no way seeks to belittle the men whose lives are lost. It's actually the opposite. I'm stating that these lives were valuable, so valuable, that they shouldn't have been in a position to lose their life screaming and sinking into the mud. And the trade-off of reason for war should be absolutely deafening when we look to the loss of civilians. What were those numbers again? 10 million in World War I, 55 million in World War II, as well as 2 million in Vietnam, 2.5 million in the Korean War, and the civilian death toll in Iraq during the War on Terror from 2003 to 2021 this year is over 206,000. And all of this is lost for the same reasons Wesley lays out. Don't let the use of prince or king in these examples deter us from seeing the relevance to his statements. What he described as princes fighting over land and control is the same thing in today's oligarchies, dictatorships, and democracies. Try replacing the sentence that he uses, prince, and just say country. Sometimes two princes, he says. Sometimes two countries make a war to decide which of them shall dispose a third country of its dominions. Sometimes a war is commenced because another country is too strong. Sometimes because a country is too weak. Yeah, the same thing happens today. Be it the losses in treaties in the early 20th century, or the seemingly endless regime change operations that the U.S. has engaged in, primarily since the middle of the 20th century, all over South America, the Middle East, and Asia. And he states later that all this for the armies to prove their king in the right. Try it there too, when he asks, what harm have the individuals done to each other? None at all. They do not so much as know them. But this country had quarrel with this country, and so these are going to kill as many of those as they can in order to prove their country in the right.
What an argument is this? And what a method of proof! What an amazing way of deciding controversies!
And I like how he relates it back to neighbors coveting things from each other.
Sometimes our neighbours want the things we have, or have the things we want. And so both fight until they take ours or we take theirs.
There's a big disconnect between our Christian values and our excuses for wartime violence. Thou shalt not steal unless it's for our national interest. And when it comes down to anything we could sum up as war crimes, the war hawk and war apologist likes to answer, well, that's war. As if the anti-war voice is so ignorant and unaware of reality. Well, they are wrong that we are ignorant, but they are exactly right when they say these atrocities are just war. They are right that these are the inevitable consequences of war. And these are exactly why we are anti-war. The loss of civilian lives isn't something that we just gloss over. It's not just a number in the history book.
What then, you ask, must we do?
Now, I like his rhetorical question too. What should we do? It's often a question asked, though not really in an honest manner, looking to examine a resolution outside of the use of war. But his answer is a great metaphor about not bringing more combustibles to the already raging house fire. Even today, I hear remarks from the war hawks that belittles any form of diplomacy. The only solutions seem to be more shows of strength, more embargoes, more threats of war. And as Wesley says, apparently, we're unable to resolve the matter without bloodshed. There are actually a lot of articles and quotes that can be found online when looking into Wesley and his stance on war. And I like this quote from Wesley in his pamphlet, The Doctrine of Original Sin, According to Scripture, Reason, and Experience. He says, "And surely all our declamations on the strength of human reason and the eminence of our virtues are no more than the cant and jargon of pride and ignorance, so long as there is such a thing as war in the world. Men in general can never be allowed to be reasonable creatures until they know not war any more. So long as this monster stalks uncontrolled, where is reason, virtue, and humanity? They are utterly excluded. They have no place. They are a name and nothing more." In an article by Brian Turley titled John Wesley and War, Turley points out that Wesley was not a pacifist and can be counted among other church figures that supported just war theory. He also explains Wesley's support for the 7 Years' War. Even so, Turley documented several of the remarks from the audio we listened to and presents the complicated case that can happen when you speak against war in some cases and then support it in others. One of these days, we will get further into the just war theory, as it's very prominent in the church from academics and laymen. Well, I hope you liked this exploration into Wesley's anti-war remarks. Since Wesley supported wars in certain situations, it's interesting to ask, what if Wesley had been in the colonies during the Revolution instead of in England? Would his perspective change? What can we take away from this? How easy is it to support or make excuses for one side of a conflict, but are we being consistent when the situations are reversed? Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcast you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episodes on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find the links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Thank you, Bobby and Keksekala, for being our newest patrons. I really appreciate your support. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
What a flood of folly and madness is broken in upon us.